This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 583 for November 3rd, 2019. Coming up on today's show, Polyweekly live from Portland. That's coming up on today's show. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Minx, and we have something a little different for you today. This is still an adult show about really lascivious things like honesty and communication and relationships. And if you're under 18, you should still stop listening and visit scarletteen.com. But the format of our show is a little different today because we recorded this show live in Portland. The organizers of the Close-In Munch in Portland were kind enough to invite us out to do a teaching session and to record a live episode at their regular munch. Super excited. And it was at this bar, which is called the Liquor Store, which kept confusing me. I'm like, we're meeting in a liquor store. I mean, we've met in sex shops and taught classes there. I guess we could meet in a liquor store. No, it's just a bar called the Liquor Store that has a performance space in the basement. And that's where we were. We had a lot of fun. We did the Navigating Your First Poly Relationship class. And it was a great turnout. We met a lot of cool folks in Portland, really hoping we get to go back. But what you get to enjoy is the fact that we actually spent the last 30 minutes of that event doing a quick interview with one of the close-in organizers and doing just a live Q&A of any poly question that anybody had in the audience. So we actually addressed like 5 or 6 different poly questions, and it was a lot of fun. So here you go, Polyweekly live from Portland.
Welcome, everybody. Cunning Minx and I are down here in Portland, where we've just wrapped up what I think was a pretty successful little workshop. Yeah? You guys like it? Yeah! Yay! And we're going to take a minute to do a little bit of singing of the unsung heroes, the people that work behind the scenes to bring folk like us down here and keep you all entertained and hopefully educated to some extent. So to that end, I'm here. I'm joined by
Hannah.
What's your name, Hannah?
My name is Hannah.
And Hannah, you're with?
I am here with the Close-In Munch at the liquor store in Portland, Oregon.
And you guys brought us down here.
Yes, we did. Our munch has been running kind of in its current form in this location since 2017. I've been here most of that time, and the thing that kind of sets us apart from other munches is that we start every single event with a class that usually runs about an hour, and sometimes for special guests we do special events like this one here on Sunday.
For the long-winded folk like us. So you've been doing this for the last 2 years. Why are you doing it?
I am doing it because for a lot of reasons. I think the first one is that I really found my home after graduating from college here in Portland through the kink community. This munch specifically, I came here the week after I graduated and I never left. And what makes munches so special is that they foster a common language, community, education, and kind of a protective unit for each other. And that has been just completely irreplaceable in any other capacity of my life. And I want to keep giving back to this community because I hear that from other people too, that they come and they keep coming because they feel safe here, they feel at home here. And that's all that we could want.
So it was good for you and you want it to be good for the next person down the line.
Keep past the good.
Right.
Exactly.
So over the last 2 years when you've been doing this, what are like some surprises in this community organization biz that you've been doing that you were like, oh my God, I never would have thought that's true?
Portland is a very small town.
Yeah?
Yeah, it is.
I think the big thing is the pleasantly familiar faces sometimes I see walking through this door. And I have started new friendships and then found them in other locations, i.e. the grocery store, and vice versa. I have seen a coworker come through and been like, well, hi, how's your weekend going there, bud? You know? And I think the best and brightest thing is that we are everywhere. Poly people and kinky people are everywhere, especially around here. And that brings me a lot of joy. It helps to destigmatize a stigmatized group. I'm all about that.
You know, when I was working in the adult biz, one of the rules when you would meet somebody in a non-adult place, right, so in the grocery store or whatever, is that you had to act like you didn't know each other. You had to be like, oh, no, I've never seen you before, even though you just spent $50 in my booth last night. Not that ever happened to me. So is that kind of the rule in the poly community down here? When you see each other outside, you act like you don't know each other? Or is everybody like, yeah, hey, that was great last night what you did?
I think it really depends. When I see my friends, and I'm really close to a lot of people in this community, it would be kind of weird to not say hi because we see each other outside of this space all the time. But I think this community is really respectful of operating within each other's boundaries and like levels of comfort. And so my general instinct is always to play it a little bit safe. But if there's mutual recognition that we can start catching up, and there's some people, if I see them, I'm probably going to like throw a bunch of grapes at them because we're friends. And that's how you show friendship.
Yeah, exactly. Poultry pelting.
Yeah.
So you've been doing this like a year and a half, 2 years now. Mm-hmm. What do you wish you would have known a year and a half ago that now you know and you're like, whew, ow?
Oh my gosh. I think the number one thing for me, especially I identify primarily submissive. I'm a fairly young human woman. And the big thing for me is that what I want is fine. And I do not need to excuse my boundaries. I don't need to accommodate things that make me uncomfortable for the sake of being liked. These are things that I just wish I could shout to everybody, regardless if they identify as kinky or poly. But gosh, if someone had just shook my shoulders a little bit when I was starting and said, square up, what you want is fine. Fuck them all. That would have been really great. So square up, fuck them all, do what you want.
Nice. Who can argue with that, right? So as community organizers, you're providing this event and this space for people to get to know each other and to create community. What can the community do to help you guys and to support those efforts?
Keep coming to our stuff. That's a big thing. A presence, moving with your feet is such a big thing. In the rest of my life, I work a lot with nonprofits, and I really firmly believe that you can kind of be an activist with your wallet or with your feet, and you can usually do one or the other. So we really appreciate the feet activism that we get in this community. Everyone is also really spectacular about donating their wallet activism when they can. To get things like a projector for the group,
we'll talk about that in a minute.
Restock on chalk, or help to bring these really exquisite educators from out of the city in to speak with us. And none of this would be possible without the people sitting in this room and the people who aren't in this room but show up every single week. And I mean, the best way to foster a community is to become part of that community. So
join up.
Join us. Join the revolution. We've got hats. It's great.
You will be assimilated. Minx and I get a lot of letters from people from all over the country asking for advice and talking about their problems. And one of the most common things that we hear is, I can't find anybody. I can't find any poly people. I can't find any kinky people. Mm-hmm. And by creating this space, this community event, you're creating a place where that question is answered, where you can find people, not only in terms of lovers and relationship, but just friends and support. So really, I want to give a shout out to the community organizers here in Portland and across the globe who are answering that question that Minx and I get all the time of how do I meet people. So shout out. Thank you very much for joining us, Hannah. Well done, and thank you for having us out here.
Thank you so much.
All right, now we're going to get Minx back up here to the microphone, which she just hates to be. I know, it's hard. It's terrible. And if you'll give me a minute, I'm going to go switch to another microphone. In this portion of the show, we're going to actually just have you guys, if you have anything you want to say, throw your hand up. I'll bring a microphone over to you, or I might ask you to move a little closer to it, and you get to be part of Polyweekly.
Woohoo! You get to be on the podcast. Yay.
All right, Portland, who wants to say something to Minx? Who's got a question? Anybody? Or a thought?
Question or a happy poly moment?
Or a happy poly moment. Always like to hear those.
So my question for Minx is, what advice do you have for somebody who is not approaching polyamory from the perspective of a couple opening up, but rather a single person who might be approaching people in couples or people in singles with other partners?
Great question. And I feel like we should give a little disclaimer that yes, we do, in this particular presentation, we did focus on couples opening up because that's most of the questions we get. That's most of where they come from. But everything that we mentioned in this talk, in this session earlier today, except for the part of discussing your existing relationship, all of that applies. And I will say until I was in this relationship, I was pretty much always a solo poly person. I was always going into existing relationships. I always felt like I was secondary. I always felt like I was the third coming in, and it kind of sucked, right? The advice that we gave really applies to that. It's always helpful to know yourself, to have the level of self-awareness, know what you want, know what kind of communication works best for you. And then do the same thing when you're looking at potential partners. You know, maybe they're in an existing relationship. Mine always were. I actually had a year when I said I would only date monogamous people because they were the only other solo folks that I could find. That didn't go very well for me, but it's what I needed at the time. Do the vetting of the existing relationship. There are a lot of times I would fall in love with one person and then realize that the relationship was not healthy. And it was just horrible for all of us in that particular situation. So do everything you can. I think Lustyguy had a great question to ask of a couple or a potential partner of any kind, of any situation, is what was the last thing you argued about? I love asking people on dates, what are your exes going to tell me about you? And it's really interesting to hear the responses because they have to think of something negative. But it's, it's kind of like on that job interview. What is your biggest flaw? Oh, it's my perfectionism. Their answer will tell me a little bit more about if that person's going to be a good fit for me.
If I can hit the topic as well.
Are you going to plug our book?
No, but I should probably. You know, a lot of times we when we talk about what is different about this, there's a very limited set of advice that I would give that's actually different to somebody solo entering in a poly. Most of it's the same, like Minx was saying, know thyself. But that limited set of different advice. One is check out Aggie Says.
Oh, yes.
Aggie Says writes a solo poly column that is specifically looking at the consideration for somebody who has their first primary relationship with themselves. She goes the next step farther and says they want to stay that way. They don't want to cohabitate. They want to continue being solo poly as they explore. And you're going to get a lot of interesting perspectives from that. And the other thing that I would say to somebody who's coming into it solo that I wouldn't say to somebody coming as a couple is have fun. Really, you have an opportunity to come into this and, like Hannah was saying earlier, right? Just give no fucks. Give fucks and have fun and go off and prounce your little unicorn pony self around and have a good time. Would be my two levels of things that I would not say to a couple.
And that website is solopoly.net. And she also has a book, Off the Relationship Escalator, that we highly recommend and is also listed on the recommended reading section at polyweekly.com.
Do we answer your question? Anybody else got a thought or question?
So during the presentation, you talked about coming out of the poly closet. I'm curious what recommendations you have as far as speaking to people who aren't poly or don't fully grasp it, you know, friends, relatives, coworkers, that kind of thing.
It's going to be different for every person. One of the things that I found was helpful for me, your mileage may vary, is that I realized that I was going to need to put on my educator hat and not take anything that they said or asked personally. It's really easy to have a knee-jerk reaction. I didn't do it until I was super comfortable with my poly. In fact, I wasn't going to come out to my family at all. But then we had our commitment ceremony, and I kind of felt weird going in and wearing a wedding ring, but not saying what was going on there. I was prepared for silly questions. I was prepared for anger and judgment. Basically, I anticipated all the questions I could. I answered them as calmly and rationally as I could. By the way, it helps to have a podcast. We've answered them before. And then I actually followed Dan Savage's rule for coming out to your family, which was they are allowed to get angry and judgmental and call you whatever they want for the first year. And then after the first year, they have to suck it up, be a grown up. And their seeing me is contingent upon their acceptance of the existence of my partner. Now, unfortunately for me, my mother did not agree to that, so I don't see her anymore.
On the topic of coming out, I have two puts. One, and this is a trick that I learned when I was working the door and security at strip clubs. People will mirror your emotional tenor.
Yes.
So if when you come out to them, you're very unsure and very scared and very nervous and anticipating a lot of conflict, they will rise to that level of emotionality. If instead you are very calm and matter of fact, and this is just like me taking the garbage out, this is how I am, oftentimes they will mirror your emotional response and be at that same level. Not always, doesn't always work, but often. And the second one is to give people credit. I mentioned earlier in the presentation my father-in-law and this, conspiracy amongst the family to keep him ignorant of things. Well, our spawn, who is transsexual, Z, came out recently, and everybody was pretty afraid Grandpa wasn't going to handle that real well. He's a man from small rural town. He handled it just fine. Loves his grandson. So don't create a problem before you come out because of your fear. Maybe they will be like Minx's parents and it will be the end of the relationship, but you won't see him as much. Maybe they'll be like my spawn's grandpa and do their best and get through it. Give credit where credit is due. Don't make a problem that doesn't exist. And then go into the situation in the context as calm as you can and displaying, or as a friend of mine used to say, modeling the emotional reaction you want them to have. Does that make sense to answer your question?
One more thought on that too. You're absolutely right. When I was first coming out to my friends, I was defensive. And so they were defensive. I lost some friends because the first few times I came out, I was kind of defensive and judgmental. And so they were too. So that's absolutely true in my experience.
Okay. I think we have another question here.
So I wanted to ask, so you've been doing your podcast for about 14 years now, which is a long time. And
it is.
I wanted to ask, how have you seen poly change and evolve over the last 14 years? You know, as a concept, as a community, as a, you know, all the things.
You know, I have to ask, has anybody read Anna Paul's original book on poly, Love Without Limits? If you read that, she suggests how to find poly people. It's take out a personal ad in the back of the newspaper. Because that was the only way you could find people back then. Like and you had to like go physically somewhere and meet someone. There was no texting. The biggest changes are the accessibility to information about polyamory, the ease with which we can meet in educational groups like this and to meet and date other poly people. You can often set it on your dating profile. And the third thing is the media coverage. In the 14 years I've been covering it, for the first few years, every single article was some yellow journalism scandal about, do you know who is living next door to you? Wah! And like they would go in with hidden cameras into sex clubs and try to find dirt. And now the New York Times wedding section just profiled a poly wedding like it was any other wedding. We've got it on Time and on TV. It's become much more mainstream and much more accepted. In fact, people tell me that when they come out as poly, like I don't even have to define it like I used to. I used to have to explain what polyamory was. Now I don't. So yeah, big difference.
On that same subject, the language has evolved. I mean, 20, 30 years ago when I was getting into polyamory, we didn't even have the word polyamory yet. And now we've got terms like polysolo and relationship anarchy. Those were things that I didn't have words for, even though I was living it for 25 years or more.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an increased vocabulary and awareness. And it's kind of like magazines, right? For a long time, the only magazine was the Saturday Evening Post. And then there was a magazine for everything. You get left-handed underwater basket weaving magazine. And
there are dozens of books out on poly now of every configuration, every type.
About 4 or 5 years ago, Minx gave a keynote at, I think it was
Poly living.
Someone asked her what she hoped for poly in the next couple of years, and she said that she wanted poly to become as boring as peanut butter.
Yeah.
And
although I do love peanut butter. So.
I think peanut butter is really amazing, right? But when was the last time you saw anybody losing their kids because they ate peanut butter?
Yeah.
I think that there's a certain level of acceptance that is in the mass community that wasn't there before. I mean, Bill Maher makes jokes about thruples. Big Bang Theory had a joke about one somebody's character's mother being poly. So it's certainly true that there's a greater awareness now. Did I see a hand up over here, Hannah?
So this has come up for me, interestingly enough. Recently, you were talking about STIs. You didn't talk about birth control in that subject.
Menopause, best birth control.
Exactly. Exactly. That's where I'm at. It's like, I don't have to worry about that anymore, but my younger partner probably might. So how do I bring up that topic with either the partner or with the metamor?
Be brave and bring it up, as it says on one of the slides we did not show today. You know, when we stop being ashamed of our sexuality and the consequences of that sexuality, then I think the world is just going to be a much better place. Bring it up. If you don't know what they're using, then ask.
the answer to how do I bring this topic up is always you just bring it up. And you practice in your head beforehand. And the other trick though that I will tell you, and this is a little kind of sneaky, but I've done it and it helps. If you can get a pamphlet, like a little pamphlet on types of, birth control is the topic, right? And leave that pamphlet somewhere where your partner is going to see it. For example, in the toilet.
Passive.
This in fact is how I introduced the topic of swinging to Elle 35 years ago. I got one of those little pamphlets of classified ads that swingers put together. It was like Northwest Connections or something. And I just left it in the family porn stash. And about 6 months later, she was like, "Hey, what's this? This looks kind of interesting." Now, I'm not really telling you that to get around just, open your mouth and say, which you should do.
Yeah.
But if having some kind of little clue that you can give to your partner non-verbally beforehand greases the wheels and makes it a little easier for you to then open your mouth and talk about it, get a little pamphlet on types of birth control and leave it where they're going to see it. And then you've opened the door a little bit. Now open your mouth and talk.
And one of the things we recommend often, but we didn't cover today, was that when you're in an ongoing relationship, we recommend having regular relationship check-ins. And the idea is that it's a safe space to bring up anything that is going well or poorly so that you can bring things up when you are not in the midst of a crisis and have drama flowing from it. We do ours every week. We have a weekly date night, and Lustyguy and Elle have a weekly date night. And, at some point after we've ordered the food, one of us will say, "So is there anything you wanted to bring up?" And it may be praise. It's like, "Oh, I've noticed you're doing a really great job keeping the kitchen clean. I just wanted to appreciate that because it's so nice to come home to a clean kitchen. And I really wanted to give that to you."
I've been waiting 6 weeks to hear that. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I learned eventually. It can also be, "Oh, well, I'm feeling a little awkward about this thing. We haven't talked about birth control." Or, "I'm starting to feel a little bit anxious about this other thing." It's the opportunity to bring that up before it's an issue. And we don't say it doesn't have to be weekly. It can be monthly, whatever works best for you. But we encourage you to do that on a regular basis. It's a great way to head things off at a pass. And then it's a little less scary to bring it up because that's when you're supposed to bring it up.
Yeah, I guess I was curious about your perspective on sort of calling people like primary and secondary partners. So I think that my impression is that this is that the poly community has kind of turned away from that as a sort of term, or turned away from kind of hierarchical models of polyamory. But I mean, the relationship I'm in right now, I definitely have someone who is my primary partner for all intents and purposes. So I just wanted to kind of ask what your view on that was.
Everybody's decision about what they want to call their relationship and their partners is, of course, personal. I think the challenge that many people feel with the hierarchical structure is that decisions are made based on that structure, and the way we treat people can be informed by that structure, even if we don't mean it to. If I'm constantly calling myself secondary, then I'm basically training myself to mentally put myself second. I'm training myself to think of myself as less than some other partner. And for me, that's not particularly healthy. Now, hierarchy works perfectly well for many people, but it's up to you whether that's going to work for you and your partners. And anybody coming into a relationship, please don't say you're not hierarchical if you are, because a lot of people don't want to do hierarchical, and just, say, "Hey, we are hierarchical. This is how we are." And just as long as you're transparent and it works for all parties involved and it makes you a happier and healthier version of yourself, form your relationship however you like.
There was a time in the poly community when the terms primary, secondary, tertiary were not only accepted, they were, ubiquitous. And even at that time, I didn't like them. And everybody's got their own thing, and that's great. And I totally support everybody self-identifying in the way that works best for them. But for me, a hierarchy sets up a permission model of relationships that I don't do. That's for parents and children. It's not for lovers. I don't need your permission to do shit. I will take into account your feelings, and I will make sure that we're partners, but I don't need your permission. I'm a grown up motherfucker, and then I'm going to get mad. And secondly, the thing is that I think that people use the terms primary, secondary, not to mean power so much sometimes, but to mean entanglement levels. And so I've kind of started substituting in to say, this is the partner, which is my nesting partner. right? Here's my partner we're fully entangled with our finances, with our child raising, and trying to describe it in that sense rather than this hierarchical sense. Because the truth of the matter is, for most of us, if your primary has a hangnail and your tertiary has a compound fracture, that tertiary is going to get your attention in that moment. Only reasonably so, right? Now, it could very well be that your relationship is set up so that if your tertiary's got that compound fracture, you're going to tell them to fuck off because their primary's got a hangnail. Okay, as Mink says, as long as everybody knows. But I think in practice, most of us don't tend to actually do that. Most of us tend to respond to people's needs regardless of the labels. And I find that talking about levels of entanglement is a little more descriptive than using those terms primary, secondary, unless what you really want to do is denote a power hierarchy. And then terms like daddy work really well. You can just do that.
There you go.
Whatever.
I will say that this relationship with lustyguy and L is the first one I'd been in. Again, I tend to enter into existing relationships for whatever reason. That just always was how things worked out. Sure, a psychologist could make a lot of that. But this was the first relationship I've been in where I did not feel secondary. The way, even though I was technically coming into an existing relationship, from the outside, you might choose to describe it that way. But the point for me is that they did not make me feel secondary. I did not feel like I didn't have a right to my own agency and my own needs and wants because they were married first. And to me, that is the most important. Other question? You could totally go twice.
We like greedy here. You go as often as you want.
So my mom thinks I'm going through a phase.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know. Life is long. But I'm wondering about, how this goes later in life. If you know anybody who has made it all the way to the end of their life, being poly.
Oh, yeah.
I would love to hear about that.
Off the top of my head, I'm like Oberon Zell-Ravenhart. And, yeah. Alena's a great example. She's back in Seattle after briefly retiring to Europe. And she has an entire poly family. She's been poly her whole life. She founded the Wet Spot, which became the Center for Sex Positive Culture. And she is still loved in poly her whole life. She's, in her 70s now?
Have you heard the name Allena Gabosch, everybody down here? If you have not heard the name Allena Gabosch, you should. Allena Gabosch is the sex community's Harriet Tubman. She founded the first sex positive community center, for example, or was part of the group that did. Allena has been around for years and has been part of this movement that's got us to the point where they're making poly jokes on mass television. She's been an integral part of it. She's always been poly. Always for the last 40 or 50 years, had multiple lovers. She retired to Europe about a year ago or so. When her cancer flared up, she had to come back. And her poly community has raised the funds to get her back here, has organized schedules of people to bring her food, to take her to her chemo sessions every Tuesday or Thursday. Tiara Thursday?
Tuesday is Tiara Tuesday. She always wears a tiara
because she gets chemo.
Her chemo,
and all of her extended poly family and network and friends post pictures of themselves in tiaras for her. So that's one example, right? I have another a set of friends, John and Irene, who have been non-monogamous since the 1960s. They're also a biracial couple, so they have that oppression, as it were, fighting against them as well over that time. And again, they have a huge circle of friends and lovers that are helping them in their age, because they're both in their 80s now, deal with that, as opposed to a lot of people that are, stuck in their nuclear family. So my perception and my observation of people that have been poly for the duration, as they get older, it's the same as raising kids. They have a larger pool of people to help them deal with the challenges of aging, just like parents that are in the poly community have a larger pool of people to help them deal with raising their kids. As I've seen things, it does. Yeah. Did that answer your question? So did somebody else have another question? I saw a hand, or we?
So, Close and Munch is primarily a kinky munch here in Portland, right? And so my inclination is to ask the question. So we're having a talk about poly, and I wanted to ask about the intersection between poly and kink, and how does that look like, and what's the story there?
Kinksters are really used to negotiating scenes and negotiating different fetishes. And, we also tend to have very specific fetishes, right? Which our partners may or may not share. And so it's pretty common in the kink community to have a situation where you are at the very least polykinkerous, where you are being kinky with other people. You may or may not have sex. You may or may not identify as poly or non-monogamous, but there's an understanding that not every kink needs to be shared, and it's perfectly acceptable to go to the community and share that with somebody who will love it as much as you do. And I think a lot of that leads into polyamory. Now, one of the challenges we had, in fact, the first time I gave the 8 things I wish I'd known about poly talk that was before it became a book was at a kink conference. I want to say Ohio Leatherfest, somewhere in the Midwest. And I was terrified because one of the things we were saying is that everybody needs to consent, relationship bill of rights. And I'm like, oh my God, my fellow kinksters are going to be like, oh, but we're 24/7. We can't do that. But I actually got a tremendous amount of support for that. I didn't get that objection that I was afraid I was going to get. In fact, everybody was jumping in saying, yeah, everything needs to be negotiated. Even in a power dynamic, everyone has to have a say. So I think there's a lot of crossover with that. I also often get asked about what's the deal with everybody at sci-fi conventions being poly as well. Also a common question, which I have come to believe may or may not be accurate, is that when you start thinking about speculative fiction and what might be in the world, then you realize that monogamy is an option. May not work for everybody. Or we could just blame Heinlein, whatever. Other questions, comments? All right, I've always wanted to do this. Thank you, Portland, and good night! And thanks again to the organizers from the Close In Munch. We had a great time going to Portland. Cannot wait to go back. And by the way, if you have questions, comments, or feedback that you would like us to answer on the show, you can call 802-505-POLY. You can always email polyweekly@gmail.com and attach an MP3 file with your questions. If you would like us to come do a live polyweekly at your event or teach a class at your munch, just email lustyguy@polyweekly.com. And if it's at all possible for us to do it, we would love to come out and do that. And that about wraps it up for today's show. Thanks to Close in Portland for bringing us out to their lovely munch. Thanks to our Polyweekly Playmates for your donations that help keep the show running and helped us pay for some incidental expenses on our trip down to Portland. We are a free resource. We've helped hundreds of thousands of people navigate their introduction to and continued success with polyamory. Your donations, your questions, your comments, your downloads, and your reviews help keep this podcast free and available for everybody inside and outside the community. Thanks for listening, and remember, it's not all about the sex.